My sister's $1 million wedding turned into a nightmare, and she almost set my son trying to make it perfect. And then, balancing my life between single motherhood and an exhausting career as an accountant felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net, where every misstep could send everything crashing down around me. But somehow, I had learned to keep going, pushing through each day with a quiet determination that never allowed me to think too far ahead. The apartment was quiet except for the soft scratching of a pencil against paper as my 7-year-old son Caleb sat curled up beside me, his small fingers clenching his pencil tightly as he focused on a particularly tricky math problem, his dark brows furrowing in frustration while the golden light of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the wooden floor. I glanced at the neat columns of numbers in my accounting ledger, my mind half occupied with thoughts of upcoming bills, Caleb's school expenses, and the constant mental calculations that determined how much I could afford to set aside for emergencies, all while keeping our modest life stable. Since the day I lost both my parents in a tragic plane crash 8 years ago, I had been living in survival mode, forced to shoulder the overwhelming responsibility of not only raising my child alone, but also supporting my younger sister Vanessa, who had still been a college student at the time with no way to provide for herself. I had been just 23 years old when it all happened, barely out of college myself, working endless hours to cover tuition, rent, and food for Vanessa, while simultaneously trying to figure out how to raise a baby on my own without drowning under the weight of it all. I could still remember those nights like they had just happened yesterday, the sheer exhaustion of working double shifts as an accountant during the day before rushing to my second job waiting tables at a barbecue joint, my body aching, my mind running on autopilot as I counted down the hours until I could finally collapse into bed for a few stolen moments of sleep. Even after Caleb was born, I never allowed myself to slow down, taking on remote bookkeeping jobs late into the night, desperately trying to piece together an income that would be enough to keep us afloat. But despite everything I had sacrificed, Vanessa always seemed to regard my struggles with a mixture of detached amusement and quiet disapproval, as though she couldn't understand why I had chosen to live such an ordinary, unremarkable life when I could have reached for something far greater. "Mom, I don't get this part," Caleb murmured as he leaned against me, his voice laced with frustration, his small fingers tapping anxiously against the paper while his deep brown eyes searched mine for reassurance, waiting for me to help him make sense of the numbers that refused to fall into place. I ran my fingers through his soft black hair, marveling at the quiet resilience he carried within him, the way he always tried so hard to work through every challenge, even when it frustrated him to the point of tears. He had always been a bright, thoughtful child, full of curiosity and endless questions about the world, and I knew deep down that no matter how exhausted I felt, I would do anything to protect the quiet, peaceful life I had built for him, even if it meant sacrificing every last part of myself to ensure that he never had to feel the weight of responsibility the way I had at his age. The sudden ringing of my phone shattered the calm silence of our apartment, the sharp sound making Caleb flinch slightly as he looked up at me, his eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of unease, because phone calls at this hour were rare, and the only person who ever called me unexpectedly was my sister Vanessa. The moment I saw her name flashing across the screen, a familiar sense of dread settled deep in my stomach, a feeling I had learned to associate with the knowledge that whatever she was about to say would come wrapped in thinly veiled condescension and an unspoken reminder of how vastly different our lives had become over the years. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, barely managing to say hello before her voice burst through the receiver with an almost manic energy, the kind of breathless excitement she reserved for moments when she wanted to remind the world just how much she had outpaced the rest of us. "Lauren, you are not going to believe this. I have the most incredible news, and I need you to hear it directly from me." Vanessa gushed, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to get them out, as though she had been waiting all day to deliver this moment like some kind of grand performance. There was something almost theatrical about the way she spoke, the way she always made everything sound larger than life, as if every event in her world was a milestone worth broadcasting, a testament to the unstoppable force of her success. Nathan proposed. Can you believe it? He's everything I could have ever wanted. Brilliant, ambitious, completely out of this world successful, and the wedding is going to be on a scale you can't even begin to imagine. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply through my nose as I tried to center myself, forcing my voice to remain neutral as I listened to her continue. Because I already knew that this call wasn't about sharing joy or inviting me into a moment of genuine happiness. It was about establishing dominance, about ensuring that I understood just how far removed her life had become from the one I was living. Vanessa had never been the type to settle for mediocrity, and ever since she had skyrocketed to success as a stock trader in New York, earning over $2 million a year, she had surrounded herself with nothing but luxury, transforming herself into the kind of woman who existed only in glossy magazine pages and high-profile investor circles. It's going to be the most exclusive wedding Miami Beach has ever seen, she continued, her voice practically vibrating with excitement as she launched into a rapid-fire list of extravagant details that sounded more like a corporate event than a celebration of love. We're talking five-star hospitality, a venue with an ocean view, Michelin star chefs catering the entire event, and full media coverage. NBC, CBS, even some international press outlets are already on board. This isn't just a wedding, Lauren. This is going to be a defining moment in history, something that people will talk about for years to come, and I absolutely want you there to witness it. I opened my eyes, my gaze drifting toward Caleb as he quietly watched me, his small fingers still clutching his pencil, waiting for me to return to him, waiting for me to remember that this moment, this simple evening spent solving math problems together, mattered far more than any grandiose event Vanessa could ever dream up. But as much as I wanted to ignore everything she was saying, there was something in her voice, something beneath all the confidence and self-importance, that made me pause, an underlying tension that sent a ripple of unease through my chest, as if I was listening to someone who was holding on to control by the thinnest possible thread. Congratulations, I said finally, keeping my tone measured, refusing to give her the reaction she was looking for. But even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease settling deep in my bones, a quiet warning that Vanessa's obsession with success was leading her down a path from which there might be no way back. When I finally arrived in Miami with Caleb, the heavy humidity clung to my skin, making the air feel thick and suffocating, a stark contrast to the crisp, dry cold I had left behind in Denver. The city buzzed with a relentless energy, the streets lined with expensive cars, towering palm trees swaying lazily in the coastal breeze, and an overwhelming sense that everything here had been crafted for indulgence and spectacle rather than practicality. Caleb clung to my hand tightly as we stepped into the lobby of the luxury resort where Vanessa had arranged for us to stay, his wide eyes darting around the cavernous space, taking in the marble floors, the massive glass chandeliers, and the towering floral arrangements that looked as if they had been plucked straight from a royal wedding. The front desk attendant greeted me with the kind of polite detachment reserved for guests who clearly did not belong to the usual clientele, her expression unreadable as she slid a key card across the polished counter, directing me toward the penthouse level where Vanessa had insisted we stay for the duration of the wedding festivities. I wanted to tell her that a simple room, something modest and functional, would have been more than enough for Caleb and me, but I knew better than to argue with Vanessa over something so trivial, especially now when her mind was so deeply consumed by whatever illusion she was desperately trying to maintain. When I stepped into the suite, the sheer excess of it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering an uninterrupted view of the ocean, designer furniture arranged with calculated precision, a dining table adorned with an elaborate display of expensive wines and gourmet chocolates, as if someone had staged the entire space for a photo shoot rather than actual human comfort. Caleb hesitated in the doorway, his small fingers tightening around mine as he took in the unfamiliar opulence surrounding us, his quiet nature making it clear that he felt just as out of place as I did. Before I could even drop my bags, Vanessa appeared in the doorway, her entrance as dramatic as ever, her voice sharp with an unnatural enthusiasm that immediately set my nerves on edge, as if she were running on pure adrenaline rather than genuine excitement. She looked thinner than I had ever seen her, the sharp angles of her face barely softened by the layers of expertly applied makeup, her sleek black dress hanging just a little too loosely on her frame despite its obvious designer label. She moved with the kind of manic energy that felt almost rehearsed, as if she had convinced herself that the only way to keep everything from crumbling around her was to keep pushing forward, ignoring every warning sign that might suggest otherwise. "You made it just in time," she announced, her voice carrying that familiar edge of superiority, as if I should be grateful for the opportunity to be here, to witness firsthand the spectacle she had so meticulously constructed. "We're about to start finalizing some of the last-minute details, and I need you to be present for a very important part of the ceremony." I barely had time to process her words before she turned on her heel, expecting me to follow without question, her confidence so absolute that it didn't even occur to her that I might refuse. Caleb hesitated, looking up at me with uncertainty, his small hand still gripping mine tightly, seeking reassurance in the face of something he didn't fully understand but could instinctively sense was not right. We entered the grand ballroom where the reception was set to take place, the sheer scale of the space making it impossible to ignore just how much money had been poured into every last detail. Tables adorned with custom-made linens imported from Italy, delicate glassware shimmering under the glow of the massive chandeliers, centerpieces overflowing with fresh orchids so pristine that they almost looked artificial. A small army of staff moved with quiet efficiency, making last-minute adjustments to the already flawless setup, while the wedding planner hovered nearby, clutching a clipboard like it was a lifeline, her expression betraying the fact that she had been dealing with Vanessa's increasingly impossible demands for far too long. Vanessa swept into the center of the room with an air of ownership, her presence commanding attention, her voice sharp and decisive as she rattled off a list of additional modifications she wanted made before the ceremony. Every request was more extravagant than the last. More candles, a grander entrance, a live orchestra instead of a DJ for the cocktail hour, and a request that nearly made my stomach drop when she turned her gaze toward Caleb, her expression shifting into something unsettlingly expectant. "I need Caleb to be part of the ceremony in a very special way," she announced, her voice dripping with forced warmth, as if she had already decided that there would be no argument, no room for discussion or refusal. "I want him to stand in front of the guests and recite something meaningful about family, something that will show everyone just how close we all are." I felt Caleb's small body tense beside me, his fingers digging into my palm as his wide, anxious eyes darted up toward me, silently pleading for an escape, a way out of the impossible situation Vanessa had just thrust him into. He had never been the kind of child who sought attention, who thrived under the spotlight or enjoyed the pressure of an audience, and the mere thought of standing in front of hundreds of strangers to perform some kind of forced display of familial unity was enough to send a visible shudder through his tiny frame. "Vanessa, he's 7 years old," I said, my voice carefully measured, unwilling to escalate the situation but firm enough to make it clear that this was not something I was willing to allow. "He's shy, and putting him on display in front of 300 people is going to make him incredibly uncomfortable." Vanessa's smile faltered for only the briefest of moments before it snapped back into place, though the sharpness in her eyes revealed the irritation simmering just beneath the surface, her frustration barely concealed by the thin veneer of forced politeness. "You always do this," she snapped, her tone taking on a sudden harshness that sent a ripple of unease through the room, the wedding planner subtly stepping back as if anticipating an impending explosion. "You always get in the way, always find a way to make everything about yourself instead of thinking about the bigger picture." I opened my mouth to respond, to tell her that this had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that she was asking a child to participate in something that clearly terrified him. But before I could even form the words, she turned to Caleb directly, her voice softening into something disturbingly coaxing, her hands reaching out as if she could physically pull him into agreement. "Caleb, don't you want to be part of something special?" she asked, her tone unnaturally sweet, her manicured fingers brushing lightly over his shoulder in a way that made him instinctively recoil, his small frame pressing closer into my side. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and if you do this, no one will ever call your mother a struggling single parent again." The words sent a chill straight down my spine, my grip on Caleb tightening as his breathing grew shallow, his entire body stiff with discomfort as he looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging for an escape. It was in that moment that I realized just how far gone Vanessa truly was, how deeply she had spiraled into this endless pursuit of perfection, to the point where even her own family had become nothing more than props in the elaborate production she had built for herself. The tension in the ballroom was thick enough to suffocate me, the weight of Vanessa's expectations pressing down like an unbearable force as she stood there waiting for me to comply, waiting for me to force my terrified son into participating in a spectacle that existed solely to feed her insatiable need for validation. Caleb's small fingers dug into my palm with an urgency that nearly broke my heart, his breathing shallow, his wide eyes darting between me and his aunt, as if bracing himself for a battle he wanted no part of but feared he might lose. I could feel the wedding planner shifting uncomfortably behind me, her carefully composed expression barely concealing the silent plea in her eyes for me to defuse the situation before Vanessa's temper ignited into something even more volatile. I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice to remain steady even as every muscle in my body tensed with the instinct to shield my son from the storm that was brewing. "Vanessa, this isn't about me making things difficult or standing in your way," I said, my tone even, controlled, despite the rising anger simmering beneath my skin. "This is about Caleb, about what he's comfortable with, and I'm not going to push him into something that makes him feel this anxious." For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Vanessa's face, a strange combination of frustration, disbelief, and something even darker that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. Then, as if flipping a switch, she plastered on a brittle smile, her hands smoothing over the front of her perfectly tailored dress, her voice taking on a condescending lilt that made my stomach churn. "You're making this into such a bigger deal than it needs to be," she said, her words deliberately slow, as if she were speaking to a child rather than her older sister. "I'm offering Caleb a chance to be part of something incredible, something people will remember for years, and you're acting like I'm forcing him to do something cruel." I felt Caleb press even closer against me, his small frame trembling slightly, his entire body radiating distress, and at that moment, any remaining patience I had evaporated into thin air. "I'm not discussing this any further," I said, my voice sharper now, my grip on my son tightening protectively. "Caleb is not performing at the wedding, and that is final." The silence that followed was deafening, a charged, brittle thing that stretched between us as Vanessa's carefully curated facade cracked just slightly, just enough for me to see the exhaustion lurking beneath the surface, the wild desperation in her eyes that she tried so hard to conceal behind designer labels and perfectly rehearsed confidence. She was unraveling, whether she wanted to admit it or not, and deep down, I knew this wasn't really about Caleb or me. It was about her need to control every detail of her life, about her fear that if she loosened her grip even slightly, everything she had built would come crashing down around her. Before she could respond, Nathan appeared in the doorway, his presence momentarily diffusing the suffocating tension in the room, though the concern in his eyes was evident as he took in the scene before him. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, though I could tell he already knew the answer, could already sense the way Vanessa's energy had spiraled into something unstable. Vanessa's posture stiffened at the sound of his voice, her expression shifting almost instantly as she turned to face him, a carefully practiced smile sliding into place, though I could see the strain behind it, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for his arm. Of course, everything is fine, she said, her voice saccharine sweet, a stark contrast to the razor-sharp edge it had held just moments before. Lauren was just being her usual difficult self, but it's nothing that can't be worked around. Nathan's jaw tightened ever so slightly, his eyes flicking between her and me. And for the first time since meeting him, I saw something in his expression that unsettled me. Hesitation, doubt, maybe even the early signs of realization that the woman he was about to marry was not as in control of herself as she wanted the world to believe. "All right," he said slowly, though his voice lacked conviction, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Let's try to keep things low stress, okay? We're already dealing with enough last-minute issues as it is." Vanessa's grip on his arm tightened slightly, her nails pressing into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket, though she kept her expression carefully composed, her voice dripping with artificial lightness. "Of course, darling," she cooed, though I could see the barely concealed irritation flickering in her eyes. "You know how much I want everything to be perfect." I had seen enough, heard enough, and I knew that nothing good would come from prolonging this moment any further. Without another word, I turned toward the exit, guiding Caleb with me, his tiny fingers still clutching mine like a lifeline as we stepped out into the long hallway leading back to the elevators. As soon as the doors slid shut behind us, he exhaled a shaky breath, his small shoulders sagging with visible relief, and I knelt in front of him, brushing his hair back gently, my heart aching at the sight of his distressed expression. "I'm sorry," I murmured, my voice soft but firm, my hands cupping his face as I met his anxious gaze. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, okay? No matter what anyone says." Caleb nodded quickly, though I could still see the lingering fear in his eyes, the unspoken worry that Vanessa wouldn't let this go so easily. I knew it too, knew that she had never been the type to accept defiance, especially not when it came to something she had already decided was going to happen. But in that moment, I didn't care about her expectations, her wedding, or the inevitable fallout that would come from my refusal to comply. All I cared about was making sure my son felt safe, making sure he knew that no matter how much money or power Vanessa had accumulated, she would never have control over him the way she seemed to believe she did. As we stepped out of the elevator and made our way back toward our suite, I tried to shake the unease lingering in the back of my mind, the quiet, nagging thought that Vanessa's desperation was reaching a dangerous peak, that her need for perfection was driving her towards something none of us were prepared to handle. And as much as I wanted to believe that the worst had already passed, that she would let this go and focus on the wedding itself, something deep in my gut told me that the real disaster had yet to unfold. The morning of the wedding arrived with an unnatural stillness, a suffocating quiet that made the air inside the hotel feel heavier than usual, as if something unspoken was pressing down on everything, waiting to erupt at the slightest provocation. Outside, thick gray storm clouds loomed over the Miami skyline, casting a dull, muted light over the ocean, their slow, ominous crawl toward the shore promising rain that would undoubtedly disrupt Vanessa's meticulously crafted plans. Caleb sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his small hands gripping the fabric of his suit pants, his shoulders stiff with unease as I adjusted the collar of his pristine white tuxedo, feeling the tension radiating from him like a physical force. "Mom, do I have to be in the front row?" he asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve as he glanced toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the crashing waves. "I don't want Aunt Vanessa to look at me the whole time." His words sent a fresh wave of anger surging through my veins, a reminder that even after our argument, Vanessa had still managed to make him feel like he had no choice but to be a part of her performance, even if it was in a passive role. I crouched in front of him, smoothing his hair gently as I met his nervous gaze, forcing my voice to be calm even as my frustration threatened to spill over. "You don't have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable, Caleb," I reassured him, my hands resting firmly on his shoulders, grounding him as much as I was grounding myself. "If at any point you want to leave, we will walk out, no matter what anyone thinks or says." The relief in his expression was immediate, his small body relaxing just slightly under my touch, though the unease in his eyes still lingered, a quiet, unshakable fear that mirrored the one I had been carrying since the moment we arrived. A sharp knock on the hotel room door jolted me from my thoughts, and I knew before I even opened it that Vanessa had sent someone to fetch us, to ensure that we were exactly where we were supposed to be at exactly the right time, because control was the only thing keeping her from completely unraveling. The ceremony was set to take place in a massive outdoor pavilion overlooking the water, a grand stage crafted with towering floral arrangements, imported silk drapery, and custom chandeliers that swayed gently in the humid breeze, their fragile glass frames catching what little light managed to break through the thickening storm clouds. Rows of pristine white chairs stretched toward the altar, each one occupied by carefully selected guests, wealthy investors, high-profile executives, and socialites who had come not to celebrate love but to witness a spectacle, a display of status designed to cement Vanessa's place among them. I took my seat toward the back of the first section, keeping Caleb close beside me, my fingers wrapped protectively around his as the sound of hushed murmurs and distant waves filled the heavy silence, the low hum of whispered speculation about the weather barely masking the underlying tension crackling beneath the surface. The moment Vanessa appeared at the end of the aisle, the air shifted, the quiet anticipation replaced with a collective inhale, as if the entire room had been waiting for this moment, for the grand entrance she had so meticulously planned. She moved with an eerie precision, her long veil billowing slightly behind her as she took slow, deliberate steps forward, the bodice of her million-dollar gown clinging to her frail frame in a way that made it impossible to ignore just how much weight she had lost, how hollow her once bright eyes had become beneath the layers of expertly applied makeup. Even from a distance, I could see the faint tremor in her hands as she gripped her bouquet, her fingers clenching so tightly around the delicate arrangement that a few petals had already begun to fall, their soft descent to the marble floor going unnoticed by everyone except me. As the officiant began speaking, a single raindrop landed on the polished surface of the altar, a tiny, nearly imperceptible sign of what was coming. But Vanessa didn't react, didn't acknowledge the darkening sky or the growing murmurs of concern from the guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her expression eerily serene, almost vacant, as if she were no longer fully present, as if she had locked herself inside the carefully constructed illusion of perfection she had spent years curating and refused to acknowledge the cracks forming beneath her feet. Then, without warning, the first gust of wind swept through the pavilion, strong enough to send a ripple through the fragile fabric draping the chairs, a sudden, sharp reminder that no matter how much control Vanessa tried to exert, there were forces far greater than her that refused to bend to her will. A second later, a string of orchids detached from one of the towering floral installations, their delicate stems snapping under the weight of the wind as they tumbled unceremoniously to the floor, disrupting the pristine symmetry she had fought so hard to maintain. A muscle in Vanessa's jaw twitched as her grip on her bouquet tightened even further, her knuckles turning bone-white as she struggled to keep her composure, as if she believed that sheer force of will alone could undo what was happening around her. Nathan reached for her hand gently, a silent reassurance that everything was still okay, that they could continue. But the moment he touched her, something in her snapped, something fragile and unstable giving way beneath the unbearable pressure she had forced upon herself. "Why isn't the media set up yet?" she hissed under her breath, her voice sharp enough to cut through the rising wind, her eyes darting toward the section where the cameras were positioned, her carefully constructed mask beginning to fracture at the edges. This entire event was timed down to the second. Where is the coverage? Where are the photographers? The officiant hesitated, his voice faltering as he attempted to continue. But Vanessa's breathing had already begun to quicken, her chest rising and falling with increasing intensity, her entire body vibrating with a barely contained energy that sent a chill down my spine. The murmur of the guests grew louder as the first low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. an undeniable confirmation that the storm she had tried so desperately to ignore was no longer something she could will away with sheer determination. Then, in one sudden, horrifying movement, she turned her gaze toward Caleb, her eyes locking onto him with a terrifying intensity, her entire body moving before her mind could catch up, her steps quick and unnervingly deliberate as she began closing the distance between them. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I instinctively positioned myself in front of him, my body going rigid as I watched her reach into the folds of her gown, her fingers fumbling for something hidden within the intricate layers of fabric. Time slowed in the way it does when disaster is inevitable, when you know something unspeakable is about to happen but are powerless to stop it. And in the span of a single breath, I saw the unmistakable flicker of a flame, the small, sinister blue glow of a lighter being held far too close to my son's delicate hair. The smell of burning filled the air an instant later, sharp and acrid, the scent of scorched fabric and singed hair mingling with the rising panic in the room as Caleb let out a shriek, his tiny hands flying to his head as he stumbled backward in terror. Chaos erupted around us in an instant, guests leaping to their feet, shouts of confusion and disbelief echoing through the pavilion, Nathan lunging toward Vanessa with a look of sheer horror, his hands gripping her arms as if trying to physically anchor her back to reality. But she was smiling, her expression eerily tranquil, her eyes shimmering with something unhinged as she whispered softly, just loud enough for me to hear, "Now, no one will ever forget my wedding." The sound of Caleb's terrified cries cut through the chaos like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, a sound so raw and filled with panic that it sent my body into autopilot, my arms instinctively wrapping around him as I pulled him against me, my hands frantically smoothing over his hair, searching for burns, searching for something, anything that could tell me how much damage had been done. The sickening scent of singed hair still lingered in the air, clinging to my clothes, making my stomach twist violently as I rocked my son against my chest, whispering reassurances that I wasn't even sure I believed, my own voice trembling with a mixture of rage and horror that I had never felt before. Around us, the wedding had descended into full-blown pandemonium, guests scrambling in every direction, some rushing toward the exit in a panicked frenzy while others stood frozen in shock, their perfectly curated luxury gowns and tailored suits suddenly insignificant in the face of what had just happened. Nathan's mother was clutching at her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as if she were physically incapable of processing the scene unfolding before her, while the wedding planner stood motionless near the altar, her clipboard slipping from her grasp and clattering to the marble floor, the sound barely audible over the rising commotion. Nathan had Vanessa by the wrists now, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he shook her slightly, his voice low but urgent, as if he were desperately trying to pull her back from whatever unhinged reality she had fallen into. "Vanessa, what the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed through clenched teeth, his grip tightening as she merely blinked up at him with glassy, unfocused eyes, her lips curling into something eerily close to a smile, her entire demeanor terrifyingly detached from the destruction she had just caused. "You just set a child on fire. Do you even understand what you've done?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting in a way that made my blood run cold, her gaze flitting between him and the chaos surrounding her, her lips parting as if she were about to say something before she let out a breathless laugh, quiet but unmistakably elated. "It had to be perfect," she whispered, almost to herself, her fingers twitching slightly as if she were still holding the lighter, even though it had already been knocked from her grasp. "Now it is. Now they'll all remember." Nathan recoiled as if she had physically struck him, his hands releasing her wrist so abruptly that she stumbled slightly, though she made no move to steady herself, no attempt to regain composure, as if she were untethered from reality itself. The cameras that had been set up for the media coverage had long since been abandoned, their operators too stunned or too horrified to continue filming. But the flashing of cell phone screens in the crowd told me that it was too late. That no matter how hard Vanessa had fought to control every aspect of this day, the only thing she had managed to secure was her own destruction. I could hear security shouting somewhere in the distance, their voices cutting through the cacophony of panicked guests, demanding that everyone clear the area, that emergency responders were on their way. But I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't bring myself to do anything other than hold Caleb as tightly as I could, as if I could physically shield him from the trauma that had already taken root inside of him. His small hands were clutching at my dress now, his body shaking so violently that I could feel the tremors rattling through his bones, his breaths coming in sharp, uneven gasps, and I knew without a doubt that this moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Nathan finally turned away from Vanessa, his face pale, his expression unreadable as he took a single step backward, his hands shaking slightly, as if even touching her had tainted him in some irreversible way. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried enough weight to slice through the chaos with lethal precision. "We're done," he said simply, his tone void of emotion, as if the realization had finally settled deep in his bones, as if he had finally seen Vanessa for exactly who she was, and it had shattered whatever illusion he had been holding on to. "This engagement, this wedding, this entire nightmare, you and I are finished." For the first time, something in Vanessa's expression shifted, a flicker of something real flashing across her face, something dangerously close to panic, as if it had only just occurred to her that there would be consequences, that the life she had built for herself, the carefully constructed facade of wealth and perfection, was collapsing around her in real time. "Nathan, wait," she started, reaching for him with trembling fingers, but he was already turning away, already walking toward his mother, who was still too stunned to speak, her usually impeccable posture slightly slouched, as if the weight of embarrassment and disbelief had physically diminished her. The police arrived minutes later, their presence only adding to the hysteria, their radios crackling with rapid exchanges of information as they pushed through the remaining crowd, their eyes scanning the scene with grim understanding as paramedics rushed toward us, their faces tight with concern as one of them knelt beside me, his gloved hands reaching out toward Caleb with gentle precision. "Ma'am, is he injured?" the paramedic asked, his voice calm, professional, though I could see the subtle crease of concern in his brow as he took in Caleb's pale, tear-streaked face. I forced myself to loosen my grip just enough to let them check him over, my hands trembling as I smoothed his hair back, my heart pounding violently against my ribs as I watched them assess the damage, my breath catching when one of them spoke. "The burns are superficial, no severe tissue damage," the paramedic assured me, his tone reassuring but firm, his hands moving carefully over Caleb's head as he applied a cooling gel to the reddened patches of his scalp. "We'll still take him in for observation, but I don't see any immediate risk of lasting injury." Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I thought I might collapse under the weight of it, my body sagging slightly as I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding, my fingers curling into the fabric of my dress as I fought back the overwhelming urge to sob. But even as my mind tried to process the fact that my son was physically unharmed, the deeper, more insidious truth settled like a stone in my gut. No amount of medical treatment would erase what had just happened. No superficial healing would undo the trauma that had already been seared into his memory, into mine, into the lives of every single person who had witnessed Vanessa's descent into madness. As they loaded Caleb into the ambulance, I turned my gaze back toward the ceremony space one last time, my breath catching at the sight of Vanessa being led away in handcuffs, her face devoid of any recognition, her expression eerily blank, as if her mind had already severed itself from the reality of what she had done. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke above us, fat droplets of rain splattering onto the marble floor, washing away the remnants of the ceremony that had never truly begun, the once pristine decorations now nothing more than soaked, wilted remnants of a dream that had never been real to begin with. I climbed into the ambulance beside Caleb, my fingers wrapped tightly around his as the doors shut behind us, the sound of sirens cutting through the humid Miami air as we pulled away from the wreckage of my sister's perfect life, leaving behind the pieces that could never be put back together again.